Jumping back to TMNT03, we're getting to the point in the series where I remember things getting good, and y'all have said things really get good. And thankfully, I gotta say, this was really stinking good. Originally, I wanted to talk about both parts of this episode at the same time, but this one just sets up so much stuff that I feel like it needs to be talked about on its own. First of all, I want to talk about immediately, right out the gate, the fact that this episode kind of pulls the rug right out from under you. This part one, but the entire two-part episode in its entirety too, because part one starts out like any other episode of a cartoon that's clearly setting up and telegraphing a message. Specifically, the turtles are training, and Leo gets kind of a big head. He's able to beat the others, and he's convinced that it's because he wields katanas, the superior ninja weapon. And actually, I'm going to go on a rant about that later, but I'm going to hold off for now because I have plot stuff to talk about, only for Splinter to come in and showcase his skills a little bit by completely owning Leo, despite the fact that he's just wielding a stick. And makes the point that, more or less, he's a little more wordy about it, but it's the man who makes the weapons, not the weapon that makes the man. Saying explicitly that there's more that Leo needs to learn, and implying that at least some of it is stuff that he has to learn on his own, through his own hardship. That Splinter can only kind of set him on the right path. As all this is happening, though, while he's up on the surface, on top of a building, doing some alone time training, he's sent a message by one of those ninjas that he and his brothers keep bumping into. Those ninjas that we know are the Foot Clan, who work for the Shredder. But he doesn't know that, which is a great example of irony. It's always fun when the audience knows and understands something that the characters don't. Because not only does it create anticipation for the moment that they come to understand it as well, but feeling more in the know than the character helps you stay invested in the story. And like anybody who's watching TMNT nowadays, like the turtles they're so ingrained in pop culture. Unless you're like a very young kid, you have some idea of these things already going into this. But that's where the brilliance of this episode comes in, because we see the Foot Ninja line up a shot with a bow, and you expect he's planning to attack Leonardo, and that Leonardo's not going to be able to defend himself because he relies too much on his weapons and he's going to be hurt, or something along those lines. But no, it's to send a message. The arrow is carrying a message. He is called to audience with the Shredder, who doesn't call himself the Shredder, obviously, because that would hurt his case, who tries to recruit him to team up with him and his Foot Clan against a common enemy. And immediately after this, after he gives Leo a famous katana, so famous that Leo actually knows the story of its making, we get a little bit of a preview of what we are supposed to assume is that enemy. And they're creepy. They're these people who are they're just a little off. They're dressed just a little off. And they have sci-fi tech. And they're watching Leo. And they say flat out that if he and his group ally with the Shredder, they'll have to be destroyed, because that would make the Shredder, their enemy, too dangerous. And this is said over comms by a council of 3 people who, despite looking distinct, all speak with the same voice. It's very off-putting. And immediately it ramps up the tension here. There is more to this than meets the eye. And this is pretty atypical for a Turtles adaptation, so far as there had been Turtles adaptations up to this point. This is not the original series, for example. It doesn't even feel like a modernization of the original series, like a lot of these episodes have seemed like they were trying to feel like, despite taking plots from the comics. And Leo is almost swayed. It isn't until his brothers, who overheard his conversation with the Shredder, confront him, and they get into a fight that leads him to almost seriously hurt Raph, that he realizes he dove headfirst into this a little too hard. Maybe they should go talk to their master first, before he makes any decisions. And this is when Splinter gives his backstory, and it's a very typical Splinter backstory. He was the pet rat. His owner was killed by the Shredder. He tried to save him but couldn't. Then Ooze, then Turtles, then Ninja. Explaining that he knew who the Foot were, and he just hoped that the problem of the Foot would go away, and that he wouldn't have to drag his sons into this storied history. He didn't want to cloud their lives and their training with this hatred that he himself still carries, and drag them in and make this their vendetta, which is stupid. He should have told them, but it makes sense. It makes sense for his character to make this choice, and I can understand it. What's interesting here, though, and again, this is a bit of a curveball compared to what the pop culture might have told you about the Turtles. The Shredder didn't kill Hamato Yoshi because he was jealous of him or whatever, like what is typical. He killed him because he believed that Yoshi was in league with this mysterious enemy. And for all we know, maybe he was. What we've been seeing from these mysterious figures, with them waiting to see where the Turtles would end up landing within this dynamic, maybe we are going to find out that they're the good guys. That maybe they just don't seem like it initially. And maybe Yoshi was their ally, and the Turtles are going to have to learn that and team up with these guys down the line to beat Shredder and his side. It gets you thinking about who these people might be and what role they might serve in this story. At the very least, they are a third faction, which at this point in a typical Turtles story is not something that you would necessarily expect. This, of course, though, leads to a confrontation between the Turtles and the Foot, where Leo refuses the Shredder's offer. They fight a bunch of Foot ninjas. Then Hun shows up, they fight him, and he tries to use that special katana against Leo and even bests him in weapon combat, only for Leo to fight without his swords and manage to defeat Hun through his own skill without relying on the weapons as a crutch. And that is the only resolution we get to the apparent big deal message that the episode was trying to set up. And it still gets a message across that you should never think that you're finished learning, that you should always be willing to learn more, that you shouldn't think too much of yourself, you shouldn't rely too much on tools and focus more on your own skill. Stuff like that. It all comes across. But that's it. There's no big coda. We just get this one scene, and if you don't make that connection between it and the stuff at the beginning, then the message show aspect of this is completely lost. Instead of getting a coda and a wind down at the end of the episode, Shredder shows up, and then the episode ends on a cliffhanger. It's really strong. It plays with your expectations in really masterful ways and kicks the intrigue of this series up to 11. Prior to this, the show was just kind of mid for the most part. It was fun. It had some really strong animation. The action in particular tended to be pretty good. But for the most part, it just felt like the edgy, quote-unquote, modern retelling of what was a really goofy cartoon back in the day. it wasn't really anything special. This episode, though, feels special. Even the action here feels like it's a step up. Everything from that training fight at the beginning, which was as technical as some of the best choreographed fights in this show so far, to the brief conflict between Leo and Splinter, where Splinter just owns the crap out of him in like 3 moves, to the fight on the rooftop. All of it was really well done. And on top of that, the world and the factions at play in it, it's really started to take shape here. I'm hooked. I am thoroughly hooked. Like, I still remember from when I used to watch this show casually when I was younger, that all of this goes in some weird directions that I'm not super thrilled about. Like, I don't love them. But we'll see. We'll see how I feel about it, having gone through the whole series in sequential order like you're supposed to. Let's see how I feel getting to them, having done that. And still, they weren't bad. I do remember, though, that they weren't bad. They just never really felt like they were for me, if that makes sense. I gotta say, too, that, man, what was it, 2012 when that series came out? The CG one. That version of Leo is still my favorite version of Leo, and he's always going to be my favorite version of Leo. But I really liked Leo in this episode. He was flawed. Like he feels like a majorly flawed character, but he's still competent. He's still strong. He still makes honorable choices. And he still cares so much about his brothers that seeing one of them hurt twice in this episode causes him to make a big leap forward in his character. And that's Leo. Though, just like in every gosh dang version of the Turtles, except, weirdly enough, the Michael Bay version, they call his swords katanas here. And they're not katanas. They're not katanas. They're straight, or at best, not quite straight. And while in this show especially, they're usually drawn a little bit longer than they are in some iterations of the character, they're usually portrayed as being shorter than katanas too. They're actually ninjato, which isn't actually a real traditional weapon. It's just kind of a... this is debated, but like it seems like what we think of the ninjato is actually just a misnomer of a replica weapon based on some of the shorter sister blades to the katana that used to pop up back in feudal Japan. Like the wakizashi, for example, stuff like that. Blades more that size. It wasn't until the 20th century that it started to pop up, being best known as the straight or straight-ish, short to semi-long weapon wielded by ninja in pop culture. In fact, ninjato literally just means ninja sword. And so it makes sense that this character, who started off as like a parody character in a parody comic of like silly ninja stuff in other comics, would use this quintessential ninja sword. But it's not a katana, and I really wish they would stop calling it a katana. Like, I'm not like a katana bro who, like, the katana is the greatest weapon that's ever existed. No, that's stupid. Katanas they're a specialized weapon, and they do the thing that they were made to do, but they kind of suck at everything else. Just like every other sword ever. But they're cool. And I really hate how, literally since its inception, basically, this franchise has been calling a completely different thing them. It annoys the crap out of me. It's a pet peeve of mine. I don't think anybody else cares about this much. But it annoys the crap out of me To the point that the fact that in the Michael Bay version of the Turtles, Leo finally wields katanas. It actually earns those movies a couple extra points from me. And, well, the first one anyway. The second one's just garbage. The first one was pretty good though. Maybe I'll talk about it someday. It's just in this episode where, like, they show a katana. Like the sword that Shredder gives to Leo to try to bribe him to join the Foot Clan or whatever he was specifically trying to do. Like, they make a point of drawing it with a more pronounced curve, at least most of the time, depending on the angle, than how they usually draw Leo's swords in this show. It was clearly more meant to be a katana than the swords that Leo uses in this show everywhere else. And Leo knows about it because he cares so much about katanas. And he calls his weapons katanas multiple times in this episode, despite them being right there to compare to an actual katana that looks like a katana, and they're clearly not katanas. It's so weird. I find it so weird. And I've been ranting about this for way too long. Hopefully you guys found that amusing. I'm all out of steam though. Thank God. Or I'd rant about it longer. I wouldn't be able to stop myself. That said, what do you think of this episode of TMNT 03? Did I even give the title? Did I even give the title of this one in the video yet? It's The Shredder Strikes Part 1. What do you think of it? If you have seen it, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, you might as well like the video, share it with anyone else you think would enjoy my content, subscribe if you haven't. You can also check out links to my various social medias, as well as the many ways you can help out the channel. Those will be in the video description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.